Good morning, everyone. It is 10:30, so let's get started. Welcome to our webinar. There'll still be several folks arriving as we get started. Our webinar today is Human Trafficking, What Child Welfare Agencies Should Know. If you haven't already done so, you can download the handouts there in the file share pod. You'll see the webinar handouts. These were emailed out, but certainly if you haven't already opened them up, please do so, and you can make some notes on them. So one quick note about this webinar today. This webinar was developed through funding from the North Carolina Division of Social Services by the Family and Children's Resource Program, which is part of the Jordan Institute for Families here at UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work. It's being recorded, and it will be available on NCSW Learn soon after the event. Our goals for the webinar today: by the end of this webinar, we hope you will be able to define human trafficking, recognize signs of human trafficking, be able to identify youth who have been trafficked or at risk of being trafficked, understand the needs of youth who have been trafficked, and know resources of where to go for help. So how you communicate with us today: many of you have already found the chat box. You'll see that there are a couple options there. You can send a chat to everyone, as many of you are, or you can just click on us as the host, meaning us here at UNC, to send us a private message. This will be the primary way you can communicate with us. So you'll see that this comment chat box is going to move pretty quick at times, and we do have someone that's going to help us try and keep track of your questions as you're typing them in. I'll look for some natural breaks during the presentation to have our presenters address the questions, and then we'll have some time at the end as well for questions and answers. Since this is just a 90-minute webinar, we expect over 500 people participating. We know we may not be likely to answer every single question, but we'll certainly do our best. We'll develop a follow-up document that answers the questions asked during the webinar, and this document will be emailed out to all registered participants, as well as it will be posted with the webinar recording. Again, the webinar recording will be made available on NCSW Learn, as well as that link there to our Family and Children's Resource Program webpage. If you have somebody that was unable to register and get in, please encourage them to watch the recording. Okay, if you need to get our attention, you'll see at the top of your screen there's a little guy with his hand waved. You can use the little drop down and communicate with us by saying, for example, speak louder, slow down, speak softer. And just to practice, for those of you in a group, so you're participating in a group at your office, if you will, please use the raise hand icon to let us know. Great, I see we do have some folks participating in a group. Normally we do a poll to give you a chance to tell us what your role is, but since we do have such a large group today, I'll just give you a snapshot of who's registered. So of our more than 500 registrants, there are 413 direct line staff, 12 agency directors, 99 supervisors, 30 program managers or program administrators, 14 county DSS trainers, and several others. Again, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm Rick Zeckman with UNC Jordan Institute for Families, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. We also have technical support from our colleagues Philip Armfield and John McMahon. So certainly if you're having any issues with audio, anything else with getting in, you can get with Philip and he'll certainly try and help you troubleshoot that. I'll allow our presenters to introduce themselves, starting with Erin Conner.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Erin Conner. I'm the Links Coordinator for the State Division of Social Services. I work also on a lot of child welfare policy issues, and I am the liaison for the division for Project No Rest, which I'll talk about momentarily. And I've been working on the child welfare system response to trafficking for a few years now. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today.
Glad to have you, Erin. And now, Lindsey Roberson.
Hey everyone, this is Lindsey Roberson. I'm a private practice attorney at McGuire Woods in Wilmington, North Carolina currently. Prior to my current employment, I was a state prosecutor in New Hanover and Pender counties for about 4 years, where I prosecuted, among other crimes, human trafficking, crimes of exploitation against children and women, special victims cases, things that were related to the topic that we're going to be covering today. In 2013, I helped to draft the safe harbor legislation, which drastically changed the way that our state approaches cases of human trafficking and prostitution of minors. We're definitely going to cover those issues today, as well as the ramifications that many of you are probably well aware of on your jobs and in your spheres of influence. So we look forward to covering this topic today and answering any questions that you have.
Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you to our presenters for helping us with this learning opportunity. We'll give you their contact information at the end of the webinar. All right, so our agenda for today. We'll spend the remainder of our 90 minutes together talking about background information, about some statewide efforts on human trafficking. What is human trafficking? What federal and state laws exist about trafficking? Share profiles or risk factors of particular vulnerable youth to trafficking. What NC Child Welfare policy says about trafficking. We will also share some child welfare practice examples and some resources that will be available for you to help those who have been victimized. And we'll spend the remaining time that we have for questions and answers. I am now going to pass it over to Erin to provide some background context to this work.
Good morning again, everybody. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of the background of Project No Rest and the background of the state division's work on the topic of trafficking and child welfare. So I just wanted to say that in 2014, the UNC School of Social Work was awarded a 5-year federal grant, and that was specifically to respond to trafficking of children and children who come in contact with the child welfare system who may have been trafficked or are at risk for being trafficked. The project seeks to achieve these certain goals. They're outlined here to increase awareness just overall on how trafficking affects children and youth, reduce the number of children and youth who are trafficked, and improve outcomes for those who are. To achieve these goals, the approach has been to bring together government agencies, non-government agencies, and other stakeholders to work together to build the response as a state and to find out who is sort of responsible for what areas, where there needs to be more collaboration, and so forth. So this project, as well as some subsequent federal legislation, has really challenged the state to really assess what the scope of trafficking is, particularly trafficking of children and youth, and how the child welfare system is responding to that issue, and how those things sort of play upon each other. The project itself promotes a strategic and coordinated approach to screening for human trafficking, assessing the impacts on the family level, and linking families with services while capturing data along the way. So there is a data collection and analysis focus for the project itself. The structure of the project there is a large advisory board of stakeholders, a steering committee, and then a subset of work groups that have worked to develop a comprehensive plan for the state with local recommendations and state-level recommendations for prevention, screening and intake, services and practices, funding, and data and evaluation. within the comprehensive plan, there are a total of 123 recommendations, and again, those are sort of both on the local and the state level. So that work has already been done in terms of the development of the strategic plan or the comprehensive plan, and it's on the project's website, which I'll share with you in the chat in a moment. And then we recently, over the summer, went through the process of recruiting and selecting pilot sites. There are 5 pilot sites that will begin work very soon to start implementation of the proposed projects in those 5 sites. Those sites, we tried to get a spread a little bit across the state. Those sites right now, the ones that were selected, the 5 sites that were selected were the 30th Judicial District, which covers Cherokee, Clay, Graham, Haywood, Jackson, Macon, and Swain counties, along with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Our Voice, which covers Buncombe, Henderson, Madison, and Yancey counties. Pat's Place, which is a child advocacy center in Mecklenburg County. Friend to Friend, which covers Montgomery, Moore, and Randolph counties, and then the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, which obviously covers Cumberland County. These sites are going to work, again, to implement various aspects of the comprehensive plan, to build their response on the local level to the trafficking of children in their communities, and to forge collaborations among various stakeholders and youth-serving agencies at the local level. And as the project proceeds through the end of this calendar year, project staff and the steering committee members will be working with these pilot sites to prepare for the implementation of their project. So we'll be starting those site visits with our sites very soon. And we'll definitely, I myself will definitely keep you guys up to date about kind of what to expect going forward in the progress of the pilot sites if you're interested in kind of keeping tabs on what the project is doing.
Okay, as we define human trafficking, first Lindsey is going to go over some information from the federal and state criminal law perspective, and then Erin will add some additional information from a child welfare perspective. Lindsey?
Thank you. I know there were some comments that my mic might not have been loud enough. If anyone wants to give me feedback now, hopefully this is a little bit better. I've turned it up. So, as I mentioned, I am currently in private practice. I represent victims of human trafficking on a pro bono basis. I'm also a certified law enforcement instructor, and I travel frequently around the country to provide these types of trainings to sector-specific groups like child welfare workers, law enforcement, healthcare providers, whoever it is that might be coming in contact with victims and need information on how to recognize those victims. And of course, in order to do that, we need to understand the framework. What is the law regarding human trafficking federally and on the state side? So when we talk about it on the federal side, what is human trafficking? Our Trafficking Victims and Protection Act was first enacted in the year 2000. And then that law is reactivated or re-upped or reauthorized every 4 years. And there's some amendments, but overarchingly, we have had the same definition of human trafficking on the federal side since about the year 2000. And largely, human trafficking is basically anytime someone is being used for the profitability of another human being by use of exploitation. I'm going to break that down more carefully on the federal and the state side, starting with the federal, which again is the Trafficking Victims and Protection Act, or the TVPA, which defines a severe form of trafficking in persons, both for sex trafficking and for labor trafficking. So the sex trafficking is a commercial sex act, which would be induced by forced fraud or coercion, or if the victim is under the age of 18, then we wouldn't have to prove forced fraud or coercion, which is much of the population that you all are working with. As a prosecutor, I wouldn't have that element of forced fraud or coercion that I would need to prove, but rather that someone is being exploited for a sex act for the profit of another person. Similarly, for labor trafficking, or what we call involuntary servitude, someone is being recruited, harbored, transported, provided, or obtained for labor services through those same mechanisms, force, fraud, or coercion. And if the victim is under 18, not needing to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So under sex trafficking, which is 18 U.S.C. 1591, a person would knowingly recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain a person or maintain a person knowingly or in reckless disregard through the use of force, fraud, or coercion of an adult or the victims under 18 for the Commercial Sex Act, and those acts for the federal trigger or nexus would have to be in or affecting interstate commerce. And you know, you all, many of you, I'm sure, have been through human trafficking trainings, and you're very aware of the use of the internet to buy and sell people across the country. And so very much by its nature, the use of the internet would itself be in or affecting interstate commerce by posting someone online. So even if the crime is taking place completely in North Carolina, oftentimes there is going to be that federal nexus to trigger federal jurisdiction for the crime of sex trafficking or labor trafficking, which is 18 U.S.C. 1589. And again, the means for sex trafficking and labor trafficking are the same. The people are being obtained or recruited or transported, but the end game is going to be what's different. It's either for labor servitude or sex trafficking. And we're going to talk a lot about sex trafficking and sexual exploitation today because that is the majority of the cases that I have handled, worked with, and prosecuted, and probably also the majority of cases that you all are going to be coming upon. But we did want to make you aware and talk about forced labor or involuntary servitude as well, which could look like undocumented minors or unaccompanied minors working in agricultural settings on farms across our state. They could look like a lot of different things, but predominantly we are going to be talking about sexual exploitation today. I'll let Erin talk about this slide.
This slide talks a little bit about the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, which was enacted September 23rd of 2014 and has a lot of impacts to the child welfare system, especially as it relates to response to the issue of trafficking. So I'll say that this piece of legislation, as well as some previously enacted state laws and Project No Rest itself, have all sort of influenced how the child welfare system is evolving and how policy is changing to address this issue. This law specifically had some provisions around the State Child Welfare Agency consulting with other specified agencies who specifically have experience with at-risk youth or youth who have been trafficked or at risk of becoming trafficked, to work with those agencies to identify policies and ways that the child welfare system can respond through policies, and to identify those youth who have been victims or are at risk and determine appropriate services for those children and youth, as well as to develop and implement protocols to locate children who are missing from foster care. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that policy has changed in North Carolina in a little bit later this morning. But just as a quick note, that piece of the legislation also includes some requirements around data collection as it relates to youth who run away from foster care or are otherwise absent from foster care. We can move on to the North Carolina statutes.
Thanks, Erin. So we want to talk specifically about North Carolina law. As I mentioned, our federal statutes were first enacted in the year 2000, which means across our country we've only had human trafficking laws for 16 years. This is a relatively new area. In North Carolina, our first human trafficking law was enacted in 2006. So we've only had North Carolina human trafficking statutes for 10 years. And again, we're really still sort of moving through this area in a new way, but also trying to do a better job of identifying victims and training law enforcement to appropriately identify victims and investigate these cases. For the most part, our human trafficking laws on the state side are very similar to the federal statutes. And in fact, since Safe Harbor was passed in 2013, we are much closer to the federal statute because we have added the bold language you see here in reckless disregard of the consequence. So what this means for law enforcement, and important for you all to know, is that when you're investigating someone as a human trafficker, the state of mind that the prosecutor is going to have to prove is that that trafficker recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, or obtained by any means, that they did that either knowingly, which is what we call specific intent and is very difficult to prove, or in reckless disregard of the consequences. And the reason that this matters, particularly for youth trafficking, is this. If someone is, let's say, for example, a case I'm going to talk about a little bit later on this morning, encounters a young female in a hotel room who is being held out for prostitution, and it is obvious that that teenager is under the age of 18, that she's got freckles on her face, she's got braces on her teeth, and she's in a hotel room that she's clearly not old enough to rent. That's a case like I prosecuted in New Hanover County in 2014. And the adult men who are going into that room after making a date based on an online ad continue to pay her for sex. They're doing that in reckless disregard of the consequences. They should know that that child did not bring herself to a hotel room and post herself online. And why that matters is now that person who's obtaining the youth for the purpose of sexual exploitation can be charged as a trafficker as well as a buyer. And we do that in very egregious cases, but when you do charge someone with a crime of human trafficking, that means that that person loses the ability to claim mistake of age as a defense. So they no longer get to argue that online ad advertised this person as 19 years old, because that person is clearly not 19 years old, but also buying sex from anyone is illegal. Buying it from a child is obviously a much higher offense, and so you don't get to claim that defense when you are charged with a crime of human trafficking. Additionally, you don't get to argue that the minor was consenting as a defense. There's nothing consensual about the commercial sexual exploitation of someone under the age of 18. So this statute, 14-43.11, is what I call our recruitment statute. So once you've recruited someone for the purpose of human trafficking, that's a complete crime in and of itself. So if you go on Facebook, you start messaging a young girl, you get her to agree to meet with you, and you do that with the purpose that she's going to be held in sexual servitude, you have completed this felony already. This is sort of the means crime. And you have in mind either that you're going to hold her in sexual exploitation or in involuntary servitude or labor trafficking, which are our second two statutes I want to cover. Labor trafficking, which is 14-43.12, is the involuntary servitude. So we said that could be someone working in agriculture, it could be construction site, it could be a nail salon, it could be a massage parlor, which sometimes also encompasses sex trafficking as well. Lots of different ways in which someone could be held in labor trafficking. And again, if that victim is under the age of 18, we don't have to prove coercion or deception in North Carolina. We just have to prove that they are being held in involuntary servitude. And again, mistake of age is not a defense and consent is not a defense. Then the last statute is sexual servitude, which is 14-43.13. And this is what we most frequently see manifested as what predominantly might be identified as prostitution, but might actually be sexual servitude or exploitation. And if the victim's under 18, mistake of age is not a defense, consent's not a defense. And as a prosecutor, I don't have to prove the elements of coercion or deception. I also wanted to point out that when we talk about commercial sex acts, it's not always quid pro quo sex act for money. It can be anything of value under the statute, both federally and for our state law. And particularly with our youth who are engaging in what we sometimes call survival sex, that youth might be engaging in sex acts for other things of value just to survive. So again, food, clothing, shelter, protection. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, as many of you are familiar with, tells us that within 48 hours of running away from home, 1 in 3 youth will be commercially sexually exploited. And oftentimes that first act of exploitation looks like this, that survival sex. That may not be sophisticated forms of trafficking that involve money, but may involve other forms or goods. So we talk about trafficking. What does it look like to recruit someone or maintain someone, and what do we have to prove? You know, generally when I'm doing these presentations, there's an element of feedback here, and we talk through these elements. But I do want to cover the statute talks specifically about recruiting and maintaining and particularly for our youth, we're looking at recruitment and maintaining that happens online. It can also happen in bus stops where someone is running away. It can happen at school. As many cases that I prosecuted, that's where someone was recruited or groomed. But additionally, or most prominently, we see that recruitment happening through the use of social media today. And I joke sometimes that Facebook is for old people. It's other types of apps that have opened up for our youth that they are really using these days that we may not be aware of. Apps like Kik, K-I-K, the texting apps that youth will use to communicate with each other when they have Wi-Fi and they don't need cell service to communicate. So WhatsApp or Text Plus, Party in My Dorm Room, Rub Mats. I've heard of so many sites that youth are using and being manipulated or groomed using those websites very frequently, or traffickers using those websites. So when we talk about recruiting someone using online, for example, one case I had, the pimp was in Virginia. He was in Virginia Beach, and he was using his Facebook account. Over the course of a 4-month period, he recruited 118 different women using his Facebook account by just mass sending messages to any young woman that he thought looked vulnerable online, just to see who would respond. 118 different young girls he sent Facebook messages to. One of the young women who responded was in Sanford, North Carolina. And within 4 or 5 days, he had set up a date with her to drive down from Virginia Beach, pick her up in Sanford, and drive her back to Virginia. So it can happen very quickly, but the use of social media does allow law enforcement to sort of track that communication once they start investigating the case. So that I just want to use that example. That trafficker, once he had sent that Facebook message and he was coming to pick up that victim in Sanford, North Carolina, he's already committed that first offense of human trafficking by obtaining someone for the purpose of sexual servitude. Once he drives to Sanford and picks her up and puts her in his car, he's now maintaining her for the purpose of sexual servitude. And that's that second statute, 14-43.13. So if that victim was under the age of 18 and he starts selling her for sex on Backpage.com or Craigslist or one of the other listing sites, or just having her walk outside on what we call the track up and down a certain road or street in the town, that's already going to be human trafficking. But if she's 18 or older, now I'm going to have to prove that he did that by coercion or deception. Our state statute doesn't even use the word force. We don't have to prove force. And so what we mean by that, and the statute definitions are there, 14-43.10. So we don't have to prove physical harm. We might just have to prove that he was lying to her, that he was deceiving her, that he was defrauding her or promising her a lot of money and then not making good on that promise. It can look like a lot of different things. It can look like reputational harm. One of the women that I worked with here in New Hanover County, her pimp was excruciatingly violent, but that wasn't why she said she stayed. She said she stayed because her mother was a prominent person in the community, and she was afraid, or her pimp had told her, if you tell your mom, if you tell anyone what I'm doing to you, then I'm going to tell your mom and all of her friends that you're a hoe and you're working for me. And that's why she stayed. I've got a question here. Can you provide a list of the websites teenagers utilize often these days? So, yeah, absolutely. Some of the websites I've already mentioned. Kik, K-I-K, it's a Canadian app, very frequently used. Party in My Dorm Room is an app I mentioned. Rub Mats, R-U-B-M-A-T-S, is an app that a parent in Jacksonville reached out to me about because her 10-year-old was being recruited on that site. Unfortunately, there's another listing site that's also become very common for youth to use. It's called seekingarrangements.com, and sort of like Backpage.com, ads can be posted for sex on this site, and we're seeing more and more teenagers post themselves on this site, which then becomes a sort of trolling site for pimps and johns, older men or pimps or traffickers who will then take the girls who are already in a place of vulnerability and then traffic them into a more sophisticated operation. And we can definitely circulate a list of these apps and websites if you think that would be helpful. Absolutely. So, and this, is probably obvious to many of you, but people tell me, we know about trafficking. I've seen some movies on TV about it. And so, it requires kidnapping or movement from place to place. You can traffic someone in their own bedroom. You don't have to move them anywhere. You can hold them there and bring the customers to them. And trafficking can happen without movement. It can happen without forcible rape, as we talk about by statute. It doesn't require physical assault, and it doesn't always involve domestic violence. But of course, these are red flags that we tell law enforcement to be looking for, because they oftentimes, this is how the cases will manifest to them, is as a rape case or a kidnapping or physical assault, domestic violence. There was a case in Brunswick County where a young woman was shoplifting. And it turned out that she had a quota that she had to bring to her pimp every night, and she wasn't working that day, so she thought if she stole some items, she could make her quota that way. So that case came up as a shoplifting case with a 16-year-old. So it can manifest in a lot of different and sometimes surprising ways. We're going to talk more about safe harbor, and I know that Erin's going to talk about it with regard specifically to the duties now triggered for child welfare workers. It was enacted in July of 2013. It became effective in October of 2013. And the three really large overarching components of safe harbor, we became the 13th state in the country to pass safe harbor. Yeah, and John just mentioned you have sort of an overview of safe harbor in your handouts. I created what I call a cheat sheet. And you're welcome to reproduce that and use that anytime. It's current as of the laws are now. But what we wanted to do was make sure that minors were being identified as victims as opposed to, quote, child prostitutes. We wanted to move people away from that definition. We know in North Carolina the age of consent is 16, and so that was a particular challenge for our state, was increasing that age to 18 to match the federal legislation, which identifies minor victims of human trafficking as anyone under 18. So law enforcement is now required to report any victim under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex or involuntary servitude to their county child welfare agency. And Erin, I definitely would love for you to pipe in on this as well.
So as far as, and just safe harbor in general, so law enforcement, again, as it says here on the slide, and Lindsey has mentioned, are now required to report allegations of trafficking of a child to you all, child welfare agencies and counties. This law amends the definition of abused juvenile under 7B 101 as follows. I just broke out where the human trafficking language was added to the definition. So if you look at this definition, it's probably in some of our policy in certain areas, but it's also, you can pull this up on the General Assembly's website. So under that 7B 101 abused juvenile, it lists all of those different things, physical abuse, serious risk of physical injury, cruel and grossly inappropriate behavior modification, all the sexual abuse definitions and statutes, all of those. So that's, I didn't want to list everything. I just wanted to point to where they added. So it's 7B 101(1)G, where the human trafficking language was added. So anyone younger than 18 years of age whose parent, guardian, custodian, or caretaker commits or allows to be committed an offense under any of those previously discussed criminal statutes that we talked about here today. So those definitions, they're human trafficking, involuntary servitude, and sexual servitude against the child. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but your structured intake policy has been updated in August of this year to include a screening tool regarding human trafficking, and there have been questions added to the intake form as well, and we'll go over that shortly. To get a little bit more information, there was a letter, an administrative letter that went out in 2014 on this topic, and it's helpful because some of it's a little bit I guess, outdated, and now that we've updated policy, that the policy will stand as what is current. But there is some information that might be helpful, such as links to the statutes themselves, the criminal statutes themselves, and also is some information that breaks down, this is also in your intake policy, but possible indicators of trafficking. So I'm going to drop that link into the chat box real quick, just so that you guys have it. Lindsey, was there anything else you wanted to add about safe harbor? Or are we going to just cover that later on the next safe harbor?
I think I'll talk about it a little bit later in the context of the pimping case we have.
Okay.
And Erin, do you see that question in the top right, if you wanted to comment on that?
Yes, so I do want to comment on that, but I'm actually going to talk about that later because that factors into our policy updates in the Child Placement Services Manual that specifically discusses when a child is abducted or runs from foster care. But yes, that's something that would be reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And I'll speak to that in more detail a little bit. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about vulnerabilities of children and youth. And just to frame the conversation a little bit, I just want to say that for the purposes of our conversation around vulnerability and risk, what I mean when I say vulnerability is that it's a condition that results from how individuals are negatively experiencing the complex interaction of social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental factors that create the context for their communities. So vulnerability in this sense is not static. It changes as condition and context change. Developing vulnerability indicators for this reason, it requires really careful attention to the unique characteristics of the group being assessed. And the conditions that make people vulnerable are usually the result of these combination of factors. So social and cultural factors play a part. So I just wanted to use that as a frame as we discuss vulnerability, especially since this is an issue that sort of transcends all of those factors. So you don't have to, it's not just folks who are in poverty who are at more risk or more vulnerable, although that can factor into the context of their vulnerability. It's people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, all cultural backgrounds. So I just wanted to sort of provide that framework as we move forward and talk about vulnerability. Specifically, conditions that can factor into the vulnerability of children and youth is that they are vulnerable to the demands and expectations of those in authority. That includes parents and extended family members. They may not be able to physically protect themselves. They may be unaware of laws that exist to protect them, and they may not always be able to articulate the nature of their experiences, and often won't identify themselves as victims. And I want to say a few things that are related to gender, because that factors into this conversation a little bit. Women in general are vulnerable because they are frequently excluded from mainstream economic and social systems, and I'm speaking of this really broadly, so this is kind of a global perspective on the conditions of vulnerability related to gender. They're often victims of war and conflict, and this vulnerability extends to their status as displaced persons or refugees, so that might give some context to victims who are foreign nationals. And all of this can be exacerbated by the secondary status that women might experience in their families or in society in general. Women are also more vulnerable to rape, domestic violence, and other harmful practices or traditional practices. They may have a limited resources or a lack of access to resources, and so just these gender-based conditions in general are often linked to social and cultural conditions, as I have mentioned before. You'll see poverty on this list here, and just to speak to poverty a little bit, it is often created by policies and preserves through structures that reinforce these same policies, and so for this reason, it's counterproductive to say that poverty is a cause of trafficking without sort of defining poverty and understanding how poverty is perpetuated. So it's not necessarily, again, it's not necessarily always the poorest of the poor who become victims of exploitation, but that might be a condition of their vulnerability depending on all the other circumstances. Lindsey mentioned earlier that movement is not always required, or it's not required for trafficking to happen, but movement can exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and create conditions that make individuals vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking. Refugees specifically, or internally displaced persons, asylum seekers, just in general, those who find themselves in volatile situations without really good mechanisms for protection. They're very vulnerable. So I'll also say that women and children in particular find themselves in situations where they might have to exchange sexual services for food or other survival-related necessities, as we also discussed earlier when Lindsey mentioned specifically youth who run away or are homeless and might exchange sex for survival purposes. Some of the risk factors, and I'm using risk factors instead of vulnerability here, just to sort of frame the conversation around children and youth a little bit more. Conditions of vulnerability and risk related to those who have experienced trauma. Children and youth who have experienced trauma or past abuse and neglect are more vulnerable and more at risk for future exploitation, primarily because of psychological effects of trauma and how long-lasting those can be and how difficult they are to overcome. Conditions of vulnerability and risk for those who are foreign nationals. They may face unique challenges that make them more susceptible to exploitation, including language barriers. They might not be familiar with their surroundings or with their laws and their rights, and they have a different, may have a different cultural understanding or cultural framework that they're coming from. Again, for youth who have run away, they may lack basic necessities. Again, they're vulnerable to the demands of those who are offering to provide the necessities that they lack. And they, again, may engage in survival sex to provide for their basic needs. In terms of community conditions, actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about certain populations. Because I've already talked a little bit about how poverty and that sort of stuff has factored in, but I do want to note that the existence of an adult prostitution market does factor into the risks for children and youth. LGBTQ youth may be susceptible, especially because of feelings of rejection or alienation that they often experience. And for that same reason, they're overrepresented in the population of runaway and homeless youth and in the child welfare population in general. So that also makes them at higher risk. American Indian youth, there have been some exploratory studies that seem to indicate the traffickers are targeting Native children and youth who have, especially those who have trauma-related risk factors. And while more data is, and better data really is needed in all of these areas, but specifically to understand this relationship in Native communities and the extent of their vulnerability, these findings do warrant concern, particularly because they're in line with results of other surveys that show that Native American youth have disproportionately been victims of some type of sexual assault. Lindsey, if you want to, we'll move to your statistics.
Okay, thank you. And to Jenny, you were asking about the Native American youth. I've provided a nationwide training for prosecutors last fall, and many of the prosecutors are from Indian reservations, Native American reservations across the country, and their challenges in identifying victims, they have explained to us, are so much more difficult to penetrate those sort of cultural issues that they find on the reservation sites. But also, one of the things I'd point out, where they have lots of casinos, there's just a lot more exploitation that goes along with that industry or economy as well. So just something to kind of think about that's come up over time and statistically. So additionally, Erin said we would talk about statistics, and as she mentioned, data collection is very difficult in this sphere. We talk about numbers like human trafficking brings in $32 billion a year. But honestly, that's just an estimate because no one's paying taxes on this income, right? We don't really know. But this year, actually in June of 2016, in coordination with the Department of Justice, the Center for Court Innovation released a study that was based on 5 or 6 pilot sites across the country, including Chicago, Atlantic City, Las Vegas, Dallas, Texas, Miami, Florida, Boston, and they interviewed over 900 youth or young adults who had been involved in the sex trade to ask them questions about when did you get into the sex trade, why did you stay in, what were your barriers to exit, what were some of the challenges that you faced, things like that. And so it's a really great study. It's open to the public. You guys can look it up, but it's over 300 pages long. So I do want to give you some highlights from that study because I think it's poignant and some of the better statistics we currently have. Based on that study, the average age of the first commercial sex act was 15 years old. And that was asking boys, girls, LGBT, covering the entire gamut. The average was 15 years old. For cisgender females, so that's women that are born as female and they identify female, that number was younger. And for cisgender males, it was higher. So again, this is just an average, but 15. 84% disclosed that they used drugs or alcohol, and over 50% of them had encountered social services at some point while they were in exploitation. Only 11% of them were seeking addiction or health services. Most of them were looking for shelter and food and things like that. 62% of them disclosed that they had tried to leave the life and were unable to do so in that study. And then 73% of them had left home under the age of 18. The average age for having left home was 15 years old, which again was the average age of the first commercial sex act. So that's not coincidental. That sort of underscores what Erin and I have been talking about, that survival sex that happens initially in the beginning. 32% of them reported their first sex experience occurred under the age of 13, and 30% of cisgender females reported that their first sex experience was non-consensual. So again, going to those risk factors with children and youth that Erin's been talking about. 73% reported illegal drug use. So 84 was drug and alcohol, but 73% illegal drug use, and there's a breakdown here of the types of drugs that the youth were disclosed that they were using during their exploitation. A little bit more about that study. When we talk about what does it take to exit the market, what is it going to take? It's going to be more than prosecution. It's going to be multidisciplinary help, and that's why obviously we're here today talking about it with child welfare workers, and the need for practitioners to be trauma informed, but also survivor informed, that we are building a network and a coalition that is informed by youth, women, and men and boys who have been involved in the life. And when I write this bullet, the phenomenon of constant contact, what I mean by that is most youth who is involved in human trafficking, and more specifically pimp control, they are very used to constant contact by that pimp. And that pimp is going to be contacting them via text message or phone calls or just consistently being by their side 24/7. So when you remove that offender from the equation, what I've learned in my prosecution and victim service roles is that you've got to replace that contact with something else. That's where the multidisciplinary help comes in. And what I mean by keeping promises is this: you set up an appointment with one of the youth that's involved in trafficking or that you suspect is involved in trafficking. Very frequently, you're going to see that youth not keep that appointment. But it's so important that we do. It's so important that if we say we're going to make a phone call or send a text message, that we do what we say we're going to do to build the rapport that is going to be paramount to building successful cases and providing support that is meaningful and ultimately leads to market exit. Someone asked, Sylvia said, over 50% encounter DSS. Does this mean we are missing the signs? It's a really good question. I think that once I've trained lots of DSS workers across the state, once they are sort of filled in, not just on the signs of trafficking is now occurring, but on those warning signs, red flags, vocabulary to listen out for, pimp talk that I'm going to talk about in just a little while, you really will start to become more attuned to the one-off situation that might be being told to you and you might be missing it. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by that in just a moment. And getting into that, let me just revisit this topic of Safe Harbor in North Carolina. As I mentioned, Safe Harbor has been in effect since October of 2013, but just as recently as maybe 6 months ago, I learned of a 16-year-old who was in custody for prostitution. So we'd like to think that we're getting the word out to law enforcement that 16 and 17-year-olds are not to be arrested for prostitution, but sometimes that is still falling through the cracks and old statutes are being used. But the law says that now in North Carolina, if you're under the age of 18, you cannot be charged with prostitution. You could be charged with pimping, but you cannot be charged with prostitution when you yourself are the one that is being sold for sex. Under Safe Harbor, first offenders who are over 18 now are required to be offered a deferred prosecution. And what that means is, under the statute, they be offered vocational counseling, trauma counseling, and if they need it, substance abuse counseling in exchange for that charge to be dismissed. We've seen some really great programs. Here in New Hanover County, we use a nonprofit called The Safe Place. That's who we run our deferred prosecutions through. And it has made a very big difference in the sort of trajectory of the lives of 18 to 19-year-olds originally charged with that first offense of human trafficking. Because once that conviction's on their record, it can be very, very difficult to get into school, to get a job, those sorts of things because of the stigma that comes with an offense or conviction for prostitution. The goal under Safe Harbor is to be victim-centered and offender-focused. And what we mean by that is, oftentimes when we talk about anything in rape culture or sexual exploitation or sexual assault, we still tend to ask questions like, why did someone go to a certain place or accept a drink from a stranger or wear that clothing or not say no more loudly or fight harder? But what we want to do is ask that offender instead, why did you target that youth online? Why did you go to that bus stop and start talking to youth that were that were loitering around? Why did you target those particular individuals on the apps, as opposed to focusing on the victims for looking for the frame of mind that we have to prove for the offender, not the victim? Knowingly or in reckless disregard is the frame of mind of the offender, not the victim, that has to be proved. And so that's really a perspective and cultural shift that we're trying to encourage law enforcement and investigators to pursue, which is a different train of thought than many of them have in the past. And one of the ways that we hope to do that was, prior to 2013, many of you may or may not know this, but pimping someone out, selling them for sex, before 2013 was a misdemeanor in North Carolina. So that meant 180 days in jail was the most we could give someone for pimping. And that's a problem because selling a drug in North Carolina, any amount of drug, is a felony, but selling a person was a misdemeanor. So in 2013 that changed, and now pimping an adult or a child is a felony. Someone asked the question earlier too about, disabled folks, mentally disabled, and I want to point out that under the new statutes in 2013 for pimping, a child under the age of 18 or a mentally disabled adult are treated the same for increased penalty purposes. So that's a shift that we're trying to make as well, to recognize particularly vulnerable populations, which of course includes folks with mental disabilities. I also wanted to just point out that we have better remedies for victims of exploitation under Safe Harbor. And what I mean by that is, if you did get a conviction for prostitution and you were either should have been eligible for deferred prosecution because it was your first offense, or you got that conviction while you were the victim of exploitation, you can now petition the court in the county where you got that conviction to have that charge dismissed, to have that conviction actually expunged. And that has been enormously positively received by the women that I have worked with. Now that I'm in private practice, helping them get those cases expunged has gone a very long way in helping them get on their feet and get back into school and sort of start on a more positive track. So I want to talk a little bit now about pimping, because I think this is something that you might be seeing more than you realize. And now that pimping in North Carolina is a felony, we're seeing law enforcement more incentivized to investigate these cases. So there's a statute there of reference, 14-203, that gives us our definitions for pimping, or we don't use pimping in the statute, we use promotion of prostitution. So under the promotion of prostitution, there's two different ways that you can do the promotion. That's either advancing prostitution, which means you're soliciting someone to prostitute for you, or you're keeping or controlling a place for that purpose, which oftentimes is a hotel or motel room, but it could be a car, keeping or controlling a place for that purpose. Or you're profiting from prostitution. This means in whole or in part. This could mean you're taking cash from the Commercial Sex Act, but it could also mean that you're staying in the hotel room that is being paid for from the proceeds of prostitution. You could compel another to become a prostitute, and that can also mean that you could be charged with pimping or promoting prostitution. And what I mean by that is that recruitment online, or having someone come and stay with you and then saying, in exchange for staying with me, you're going to be prostituting. And by doing that, you've compelled them to become a prostitute, and you are now would be liable for pimping or promoting prostitution under the statute. I want to talk briefly about this case. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. Pimp control is one of the biggest problems that I encountered in New Hanover and Pender counties, and I think one of the biggest problems we have with youth across the state. Prior to 2013, pimping was not a felony. Now it is. If you pimp out a juvenile, you're going to be on the sex offender registry. And so in 2014, September of 2014, we had a case in New Hanover County involving a 15-year-old girl who was groomed by her boyfriend, whose name was Draquan Dugar, who had 2 prior felony convictions and was a validated gang member in the UBN gang when he met her. And as many youth relationships do, he was communicating mostly with her by text, but they were also meeting in person. He introduced her to the website Backpage.com. And, for those of you, if there's anyone not familiar with Backpage.com, that's an online website with an adult services section that has made over $22 million a year for the website by posting service ads for escorts. And he introduced her to this website. She saw what it was about. He continued to encourage her to let him take photos of her to put on the website, and eventually she agreed, because this was her boyfriend, her first boyfriend. And he took the pictures in his mother's bedroom, and the next day the young girl ran away from home, and within 24 hours he had those ads posted on Backpage.com and had her in the Econo Lodge in Wilmington, where she was being pimped out to up to 5 grown men a day. The way that we intercepted this case was the young girl's mother had heard about a nonprofit called A Safe Place here in Wilmington at a church presentation and called the hotline. And the hotline is linked up with law enforcement directly. They reached out to our law enforcement partners and to me. I was a prosecutor at the time. And within the next 24 hours, we had her out of the hotel room and away from the pimp. And the pimp, Draquan Dugar, had been arrested. So once we arrested him, once we started investigating the case, we were able to read all of their text messages about all the grooming that was taking place between him and her, introducing her to Backpage.com, begging her to let him take those photos, promising her that he would keep her high the whole time that she was working, and that he would make sure all of the Johns or buyers used condoms. And we had all of this in the text messaging that we were able to use in our prosecution. So it was a great case on the prosecution side. But I also want to point out, someone asked the question, do you need your victims to cooperate in order to prosecute? And this is a great question, and we could spend a long time talking about that issue in particular. Sometimes victim cooperation is very difficult to obtain, and the women or girls that you think might be begging for your help are the ones that are telling you to go away. They don't want your help. They're not victims. And that was the case with the 15-year-old victim in the Draquan Dugar case, because this was her first boyfriend. This was her first sexual partner. She was very much in love with him. And so when once we had uncovered all of the texting back and forth, and we had this great evidence against him, he agreed to plead guilty to sexual exploitation of a minor, promotion of prostitution of a minor, and human trafficking of a minor. In addition to pimping her out, he had filmed sex acts with this young girl and then used them to blackmail her. Because she was under 18, that's child pornography. So he agreed to plead guilty and get 12 years in, almost 12 years in federal prison, or excuse me, in state prison, as opposed to a federal sentence, which would have started at 15 years. And I was terrified at the sentencing that when she spoke, if she decided to speak to the judge, that she was going to sort of undercut this sentence that was well-deserved in this case, because she was trauma bonded to this man. She loved him. And one of my prosecutor friends and mentors said something to me that I'll never forget, which I think is really poignant in this context. He said, you know, you're not here to agree with her. You're here to explain what the law is, to prosecute the case, to make the case, and to give her her voice back. And so if she wants to stand up and tell the judge at 15 years old that she loves this man who videotaped her having sex with him, who pimped her out to grown men 5 times a day in a hotel room, who gave her drugs and alcohol, who allowed 4 of his friends to come and have sex with her one night and steal all of her money, then let her have her voice. You're the voice of reason, and you're helping her move forward and gain her voice back. And I just thought that was really, really poignant in this case. And it's really stayed with me, because working with this population sometimes is surprising in the sense that the victims don't want to cooperate. And you do have to build a case without their cooperation. And it's very challenging. And I don't want to pull any punches there. But I do think that is why building relationships with your victims, with your clients, is so important, because you have to etch away at the trust they have with the trafficker and build trust with you. And so I think that I learned, a lot of lessons in prosecuting that case. Also, too, I just wanted to point out, because someone had this question, and here's a slide that answers sort of your question. If someone is being sold to support someone else's drug habit, is that trafficking? Absolutely. If any of you are familiar with the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, this is a little clip from that show. The girls are asking her if she's into Molly, obviously meaning the illicit drug, but she thinks they're talking about an American Girl doll. And we are seeing more and more cases, just like with Drake on Dugar, where pimps and traffickers are either building a drug dependency with their victims, or they're exploiting a drug dependency to keep them working for them. I'll give you your next hit, but only if you service the next 5 Johns. And that is, drugs as coercion has been specifically recognized by many courts across the country to say that it meets the definitions of force, fraud, or coercion by exploiting drug habits or drug addictions. And that's something, particularly in the child welfare system, that I think everyone needs to be aware of. Obviously, if the victim's under 18, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. But I think there's this idea sometimes that, if they're using drugs or alcohol, then this is just a party life. But that's not the case, and you all know that. But I did want to point that out in this case too, because what often can happen, let's say we didn't intervene in the case of Raquan Dugar, that he took her from Wilmington to Baltimore, and from Baltimore to New York City, and he continues exploiting her, and now he wants her to recruit someone else for his stable, for his pimp world. And now she becomes what's known in the industry as the bottom. And the bottom here, this quote is from a book called Pimpology, which has all the language. There's an app for Pimpology. There's a PDF. You can download it right now. The 48 Laws of the Game. And it's all the pimp language you never wanted to know. But the bottom is the girl who keeps the business running for the pimp. And sometimes that means she starts recruiting other girls for him. And so then you have a situation where that 15-year-old becomes 18. She's working for him, and she's recruiting girls for him who are under 18. Do we prosecute her, or do we identify her as a victim? And again, that's just a very difficult sort of area to look at, and it's something I wanted you all to be aware of. There's a girl right now in custody in New Hanover County. This sort of is her statistical bullet points here. She's 25. She was sexually abused as a child. She was a heroin addict. She was working for her pimp on Backpage.com when she was introduced to a 17-year-old who was already addicted to heroin, who started working with her for the pimp. And then she was charged with promotion of prostitution of a minor, profiting and advancing. And, you know, that's just sort of, unfortunately, sometimes can be that trajectory when we don't intervene, like with the victim with Drake Wandugar. She was actually intervened, and yes, whoever just said Pimpin' Ken is the author, that is correct. Thank you. If we don't intervene, we don't intercede, this is unfortunately oftentimes going to be the direction in which young girls end up traveling. So I wanted to sort of make that circle with that case example. Let me see what we've got up next. I'm going to lump to Erin.
I'm going to talk with you guys a little bit about the policy changes that have happened in child welfare so far, and then give you sort of a glimpse of what is coming. Because if you remember, I talked earlier about the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act, and how those provisions of the law that really impact child welfare really impact the spectrum of child welfare policy, from intake and assessments to in-home and foster care. So we'll talk a little bit about what's happened so far, and then what you guys can sort of look for in the future. So in August of this year, we actually released updated intake policy that included a multitude of changes, but what the changes I'm just going to discuss today are around human trafficking. So not only was the intake tool, the DSS 1402 itself, updated to include specific questions about human trafficking, there was a human trafficking screening tool added to the structured intake policy that gives some guidance around those questions and screening of alleged trafficking, as well as some possible indicators. I'll talk to you a little bit about what some of those indicators are, and they're in the policy, but they're also in the link to that administrative letter that I sent you before. And I'll ask Lindsey to chime in if she has anything specific that she wants to add in terms of indicators. And one of the things that I think we've discussed probably at length today would be that the child or the youth has a significantly older, controlling or abusive boyfriend or girlfriend or romantic partner, or someone they perceive as their romantic partner. They may, in terms of behaviorally, they may be fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, tense, or nervous. They may have inconsistencies, and in fact, they probably will have inconsistencies in their stories. They may exhibit some sudden or really dramatic changes in their behavior or the people that they're hanging out with. They may have some issues at school or absences from school. Again, Lindsey had mentioned substance use issues, so they may have already developed some substance use habits, and the traffickers are looking to exploit those to maintain control. Physically, they might have signs of trauma or physical abuse. They might have special marks or tattoos. So that is something definitely to look out for if they have either a brand or a tattoo. They may be malnourished or lack health care, show signs of physical restraint or confinement. Not always, but that could be an indicator for sure. They might have untreated sexually transmitted infections. In terms of their home environment, they might have multiple people in and out of the home. They might be isolated in terms of their activities. They may not be able to interact with the community or with their peers. Youth might be homeless or have run away from home or from foster care. A child or youth might have their communication restricted or not be able to really speak for themselves. And again, the biggest one here is anyone under the age of 18 that is involved in a commercial sex act. They might travel with adults who they're not their parents or their guardian, or they might be their parent or guardian that's actually exploiting them. If the youth owes a debt that they're not able to pay off, that is a big red flag and something that I want you guys to sort of be on the lookout for, as well as any indications that the youth might have a a boyfriend or a girlfriend that is asking them or forcing them to make money for them. And again, history of trauma and their family of origin or history of involvement with the child welfare system might also be something that is a factor at play. I also want to point out that in the dependency screening tool, there was some language added in the tool directions around children and youth who may not have a parent or caretaker, or they may have run away from home. They're vulnerable to exploitation. They may have already been exploited, and intake workers may need to ask some further questions to explore the child's circumstances. I suspect that, I don't know what kinds of experiences you all on this webinar have had in terms of taking intakes that might have some allegations involving trafficking or involving dependency and how those things connect, but I just wanted to point out that I suspect that many times you might be receiving reports of this nature that you end up screening for dependency rather than for human trafficking, but human trafficking might be a factor, especially as we talk about children and youth who are trafficked by people who are not their parents, by people who are not their relatives or would not meet that definition of caretaker under the law. Those cases, I would suspect, would probably be screened as dependency a lot of the time, or you might be receiving calls from law enforcement when they discover youth in these situations and they don't know who or where their parents are. They may be even in another state. So that's just something to point out, that there's some guidance in the dependency screening tool for that reason. Lindsey, did you want to speak to any indicators at all, or dependency issue?
Hey, thanks. I was just going to follow up on a couple quick things and a couple questions. Someone, I think Carol said, how would we know the difference in tattoos and brands? And that's a great question. If you're seeing particularly young youth, 13, 14, 15 years old with tattoos, I think in general that should be a red flag to you, period. And my advice for questioning about tattoos is sort of my advice at large as you interview victims or youth that you think might be involved in the sex trade, which is this: you never ask the question. Are you a victim of sexual exploitation? Are you a victim of human trafficking? You always ask the one-off question, which is, for example, sometimes what I say to a victim is this: I see that you've got a tattoo, and that's really interesting because I've been thinking of getting a tattoo, and I was wondering, was it really painful? What did it feel like? Were you scared? And getting them talking about a subject that will, by definition, move into the question that you really want to ask will get you so much farther than asking the question that you really want to ask, which is, are you being pimped out right now? And that's my advice to you. I tell that in my healthcare trainings all the time, to just have that sort of casual repertoire with particularly with youth, as casually as you can, because at the moment that they perceive that this is sort of an interrogation, they're going to shut down and clam up and stop talking. The only other advice I have too is this, which is knowing those terms that are in the book Pimpology, knowing the language that's used, like the word bottom. If you ask someone if they're a victim of human trafficking, they'll look at you like you have three heads. But if you say, are you the bottom, to someone who you suspect is the top girl in a trafficking situation, or just one of the girls in a trafficking situation, her reaction is going to tell you a lot. So knowing that language is really important, just like when we need to know the drug language to investigate vice crimes. And that's advice I give a lot. I think there are a lot of different indicators of human trafficking, many of which we've talked about, but some that we haven't. And pimps are very entrepreneurial. One of the pimps I was prosecuting when I left the DA's office met heroin addicts outside the plasma bank and gave them his card because he knew eventually they would get locked up for drug offenses. They would then call him to help get bonded out of jail, and when they got bonded out, they would work for him on Backpage until he said stop. But while they were working for him, he was also feeding their heroin addiction. I mean, it's just as fast as we make laws to and policies to change and address these problems, pimps are going above and beyond in the way that they exploit and recruit. So it's changing every day. One of the pimps I prosecuted, he didn't brand his girls with tattoos. He branded them all with microderm piercings under their skin. So, I mean, it's something new with every pimp, and we're trying to give you best practices. Um, but I think more than anything, it's becoming aware of, you know, the types of conversations you might be having with youth, about where are they sleeping, where are they living, when was the last time that they had a real conversation with a good friend. Those one-off questions, I think, just oftentimes give us a lot more information than, per se, intake forms may or may not really kind of peel the layers of the onion back to give you the information that you're looking for.
Thank you, Lindsay. Oh, I'm not done with that slide yet. I'm going to switch it back. So I'm going to talk just real quickly about the changes in the placement manual, and that's specifically going to address, I think, some of the questions we had earlier around youth who run away or are AWOL from foster care or maybe abducted from foster care. Part of the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act legislation specifically addressed this issue and directed states to make policies around this issue. So some of the things that are included in this policy update that was from September of 2015 include definitions of what is abduction, what is runaway, what is a missing foster child, what are children who might be at high risk, those sorts of things. What are some risk factors and how do you assess for runaway risk? And making sure that you are assessing and planning around that when you have young people or youth in foster care. Some measures around runaway prevention and what the reporting requirements are for caregivers, placement providers, and child welfare workers when a youth runs from foster care. And I'm going to talk specifically about what the reporting requirements are. So let me flip to that real quick. So reporting requirements for caregivers and placement providers. So in the policy it says caregivers, including foster parents, relative caregivers, and staff of residential facilities shall immediately report any missing child to the local law enforcement agency and the child welfare agency. I wanted to point out something important, and this was communicated to me when this policy was being developed, and the division actually did touch base with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children around the development of this policy. If your agency does not have legal custody of the child, then you won't be able to report to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. You can report to law enforcement and they can report it, or the child's parent or caregiver can report to the National Center. You can report to the National Center if you have legal custody of the child. So that's going to take some coordination with parents or with law enforcement if you don't have custody and the child is run away. So in terms of reporting requirements for workers, when you learn that the child or youth for whom your agency is legally responsible is missing, you need to immediately verbally make notification to the appropriate law enforcement agency, and this is followed up by sending a subsequent written notification within 48 hours. There's a variety of things that need to be addressed in this notification to law enforcement, and that's in the policy as well. In addition, you will need to notify immediately, verbally, the child's family if they're not believed to have been abducted by family members, as well as the guardian ad litem. Immediate notification no later than 24 hours to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They have a phone number. There's also a mechanism for reporting online, and that's all in the policy as well. You'll have to file a motion with the court within 10 to 14 business days after the child is known to be missing to make sure that they are informed that they're missing and the efforts that your agency is engaging in to locate them. And again, documentation is going to be important in terms of notification to appropriate parties such as law enforcement, parents, caregivers, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, guardian ad litem, and the court. A couple of things I wanted to point out. This is around photographs. I know that there are certain parameters around photographing and maintaining photographs of children in foster care. It was recommended to me, although it's not currently in this current iteration of the runaway portion of the policy in out-of-home placement services, but I'm looking towards updating it to reflect this. It was a recommendation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that as soon as possible, when a youth is located, taking their picture. Again, even if you have already a picture maintained in their file, because you don't know what kinds of physical changes they might have gone through during the time that they were absent from care. And if they leave care again in very short order, then you're working off of an old picture at that point. So updating photographs as regularly as possible is highly recommended. So I'll just say that in terms of searching for missing youth, and some special considerations around when youth are located, and placement considerations are also included in the policy if you want to take the time to review that as you're able to do so on your own time. Going forward, we're looking at addressing trafficking in assessment policy, and those changes should be coming probably sometime next year, and likely there will be an opportunity for counties to engage in that process as we develop policy for that area. So I want to go ahead and move on to practice so that we don't get too far behind. I do want to say that something that's important, and before I turn things over to Lindsey to talk a little bit more about her experience and working with youth who have been trafficked, comprehensive assessments with families are really important because, again, this may not be what you screened it in for. In fact, it might not even have come up during the intake call. But if you see or hear any indicators during the course of your assessment, that's going to be really important to document and to reach out to your resources and your community, law enforcement, and others if you suspect that trafficking is occurring. And again, I'll say that this includes assessing a parent or caretaker's own history of trauma, particularly if there's domestic violence in a household, as that might be that it might be a factor that's closely related to trafficking, or if there is like a generational history of prostitution. Maybe a parent was prostituted when they were by their parent or caretaker, and they're carrying on that family tradition. This is really important to assess, and as well as the identification of immediate needs when trafficking is identified. Either a child or youth comes to you by way of a law enforcement operation, and you know that that's an issue at the outset, or whether it's identified later on. And these are things like safety, immediate mental or behavioral health concerns, medical concerns, specifically if there is substance use involved, physical health, any legal issues, or language or cultural barriers. And I'll just say really quickly about transitioning a case is also really important. Whoever is responsible for the overall coordination of services for that child or youth, transition is really important. So even from intake to services, that should be as seamless as possible. So it's highly recommended that even if you are referring for additional services to agencies outside of yours, coordinating that with whomever is going to be handling those other aspects of the case, and having even possibly staffing those cases together and incorporating those other people as part of that child's team. I wanted to say so much more about that, but I'm going to let Lindsey talk a few minutes before we have to move on.
Now, Erin, if there's more that you want to talk about, let's go for it. But I did want to ask you too if you could address Mandy's question about the definition of caretaker.
So that's something I want to address in a little bit more detail in the follow-up document, but I will say that in most instances, I would say that no, they are not going to fall into that definition of caretaker unless they are a caretaker under the law. So they may be a person who has been providing for the youth based on the parent saying so, essentially. but a person who has recruited a child or youth and the child or youth has left home and this person is of no relation to them, they're probably not going to meet the definition of caretaker.
Okay, thank you. I know we need to be wrapping up, and so I just want to talk a little bit about, or just for a minute, about building the rapport and establishing trust, which we've been talking about and how important that is. But as we lead into the slides about resources for you all in your communities, what sort of ties naturally into that is the importance of a multidisciplinary approach. And I know that many of you have already established probably career-long relationships with law enforcement in your community, and you reach out to them and talk to them on a daily or weekly or at least monthly basis. And so building the relationships or building upon those relationships and adding in this element of, okay, are we all looking for signs of commercial exploitation, and are there point people within our divisions or within our jurisdictions, within our law enforcement offices, who we can reach out to if we think we suspect exploitation, in addition to the other types of child crimes and other vulnerabilities that we're seeing. And knowing who those people are in your jurisdiction that you can reach out to goes such a long way, just like with the case of Draquan Dugar, into interceding and intervening earlier rather than later. Meredith, I wanted to also address your question you asked earlier. You said to the 50% stat in the Court Center for Innovation study. So that was that over 50% of the youth interviewed had at some point sought out services from social workers. And that's not to say that social workers didn't see signs of human trafficking, but it's just to say that at the time that they were seeking social services, they were still staying in a life of prostitution or trafficking. And that study also said that for those folks who did reach out to social services, that they asked them, they said, you know, what was the number one need that you were hoping to have met? And they were presenting with the needs of 56% said we wanted employment or education, 45% said housing or utility, and 34% said food or money. 12% said counseling or advice. So those were the types of services that they were seeking first and foremost. So they may not have been presenting with any signs of exploitation because they weren't asking for trauma counseling or something like that. They were just asking, again, for those basic necessities, which the pimp or trafficker is often totally in control of. And that's what's keeping them in that that sort of circle of exploitation or cycle of exploitation. So I know we're running short on time, and we've talked about these issues, so I wanted to just move into resources. And I know Erin's going to touch on this too, but there are many jurisdictions across the state that have rapid response teams specific to human trafficking. And in your handouts, I think you have a list of those if they apply to your jurisdiction. And those are teams that are created to meet the needs of trafficking victims within the first 24 to 48 hours after being identified. Obviously, using your child advocacy centers or MDTs where they exist. And figuring out, you know, who in my community are providing these services so that you're not stuck with reinventing the wheel. Is going to be paramount to you doing a good job at what you can do, but also finding the folks who do a good job already at serving this particular population. Erin, I don't want to get ahead of you if this was if something that you wanted to start talking about too as we kind of close up with resources.
No, I mean, I think the main thing, I mean, other than looking at what resources currently exist in your community, you may not have a rapid response team, but maybe have a child advocacy center or an NDT. Maybe you have a strong relationship with your law enforcement, but you've not really worked to address this issue specifically, so maybe starting with your law enforcement agency, as well as referrals to clinicians who provide trauma-informed services that may preferably be trained on the issue of trafficking, and especially providing evidence-based behavioral health treatment or other evidence-based treatment as needed. I think those are the main points of things to start thinking about as you work with children and youth that may have been trafficked, and as you work to sort of craft what your response is going to be in your community.
So I'm sorry that we I would just wanted to apologize as we're coming at 12 o'clock right now, and we've had a great discussion. You guys have provided a tremendous amount of information that's been very helpful. We wish we had time for questions normally at this point. We don't have any, but hopefully we're able to include some throughout the presentation. And don't forget, we're going to capture what we might not have got to and include it in the follow-up document that will be provided to all that had registered, as well as will be posted with the recording. So I'm just going to move us right into some final steps for you. Of course, their contact information, if you want to send a thank you to Erin and Lindsey, is right there, and it's also in your handout.